Okay, I'm going to call the council workshop for Monday, January 25th to order. First, we need a resolution to hold the meeting without the public in attendance. Will someone from council please move that motion?
Moved.
Moved by Councillor Hanson. Is there a seconder on the motion?
Second.
Second by Councillor Curran. Any other discussion on the matter? Call the question. All those in favor? Contrary minded? Motion carries. Okay, council, we have an agenda that's been circulated, just has one item on it. This is the long-term financial plan workshop. And I'm going to turn it over. I don't know. I see Rick. Is Andy on? Are you going to make opening comments?
I am here. I'll let Mr. Stewart speak first. I can follow with a very brief comment.
Okay, Mr. Stewart, to you.
Yeah, Your Worship, I'll be very brief. As council knows, we do a rolling 5-year budget analysis every year. So we stop 1 year and then add on another year to the 5 years. And it's long been my dream, and that of senior management's, to have either a 5 or even 20-year plan. The district has a lot of plans, but they're not necessarily integrated and they're not prioritized. And so this initiative is really to start the discussion. I'm hoping it'll conclude by the latter part of this year, where we actually lay out a blueprint as best as we can with the information we have for the next 10 years. The one advantage of that is that we have an understanding of what our costs are or will not be, and we can plan for them. So I'm looking forward to the presentation, the discussion with council. There's lots of interesting little subplots in this in terms of public good and all the rest of it in terms of who pays for what. Future and present. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion with council.
Great, and I'll be even briefer. This is our first attempt at a long-term view of the stewardship of the district. And what it does is it brings alignment to the organization's vast number of plans and its finances. So that's the creative tension in a limited funding environment, is how do we make all this happen? And we start with 10 years. To David's point, it could go 20, but the minimum best practice is 10 years. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rick.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you. I'll just open by saying it's long been a goal of mine to bring all those plans together and have an integrated approach and achieve those objectives that David and Andy were speaking to. I think this is the first time since adoption of the OCP that we've really had a good look at a longer term view. There's been a series of plans approved in succession over those last 10 years. Most recently, the Child Care Action Plan, and before then, a number of other plans. Whoops, that's not for you, Siri. Sorry. A number of other plans, and probably the most important one before that was the Community Energy and Emissions Plan and the Rental and Affordable Housing Strategy, amongst others. So for me, getting to a point where we can have all those plans organized and collected in a way where we can have a rolling plan where we prioritize our investments is a good start. And I'm looking forward to going through the year and bringing all this information together. I'm just going to switch to sharing the screen here, and hopefully the changes we made today work. Yay, they do. Okay. So tonight I'm presenting the first of a 2-part workshop series on the long-term financial plan. The second part is planned for the end of this year, following a series of workshops that will inform part 2. Having more certainty in our planning supports longer-term thinking and allows us to focus on outcomes for the community. It also helps us improve the way we communicate and engage with the community. Measuring the imbalance between our approved plans, strategies, and finances allows us to begin this process in a meaningful way. This analysis assesses funding required to maintain our services and infrastructure, as well as funding required for new investments that improve our services and move us closer to the community vision. The current funding gap to deliver on this service vision is estimated at just under 20% of the district's 10-year project plan, or approximately $200 million. Staff suggests this gap can be resolved following our current approach to property tax and utilities and the financial strategies identified in the report and tonight's presentation. Staff see this as an opportunity to build on the district's legacy as a leader in financial planning and asset management, and are seeking direction from council to develop options to bring the plans, strategies, and finances into balance and present them for discussion at a future workshop. And just one point I wanted to make before I get into more of the presentation. We did have some feedback on tonight's presentation. I just want to emphasize that this is a look at our long-term financial position. A separate presentation on the 5-year financial plan and 2021 budget will be introduced on February 8th. Oh, there we go. This presentation, without questions, will take about 25 minutes. I do have a lot of information to go through, so I'll be speaking to key points, and we'll pause for questions as we get into the long-term plans and the gap analysis. But before that, I'll review the objectives, timelines, issues, and risks to place discussion on the long-term plans into context. The main objective for today is to share a scenario for the future based on the approved plans and strategies and the estimated funding gap to realize that future. We've identified emerging financial strategies to help close the gap, and the process relies on information and directions from other workshops to develop options to bring the plans into balance. This workshop is the first step in a series of workshops over the course of the year that support an integrated planning approach aimed at bringing our services and finance into balance. Workshops on the OCP, facilities, transportation, climate action, and financing will provide information and directions that inform our long-term financial position. Both climate action and financing follow the first 3 workshops, as they're dependent on information and directions from those workshops. Part 2 of the long-term financial plan will include options for council's consideration in order to bring the plans into balance. After reviewing the 10-year project plan, a number of key issues rise to the top. The next 2 slides identify those issues, starting with community recovery to affordability limits and our role in emerging services and planning for major new investments. There are a number of important issues to address. Our role in some adaptation measures, taking action on climate change, keeping pace with change that's happening around us, and ensuring fairness in our finances are the key issues shown here. We'll need to make provisions for risks as our role on some of these issues becomes clearer, and as our information improves, we'll be looking at new ways to communicate and engage with the community, including sharing the status of our current investments and plan new investments, as well as highlighting the importance of that new work. There are a number of key decisions for council to make, and as we integrate directions from other workshops and continue to develop our financial strategies, it will become clear how much of a gap remains by the end of the year. Number of risks are also identified. This is not an exhaustive list, but it provides some context to the level of uncertainty embedded in this plan. The risks most under our control are our readiness to deliver our projects, our ability to keep pace with change, and our relationships with other levels of government. We may not be able to directly change the legislation that we don't agree with, but having good relationships with those other levels of governments allows us to have conversations and influence outcomes that impact our community and our ratepayers. Now we're going to take a look at the current state of our long-term plans, including the impacts from COVID at a very high level, and how our services may change over the next 10 years. We'll look at the funding gaps by goal, or the imbalance by goal, and which financial strategies might help us bring those plans into balance. COVID has brought a host of challenges, including financial impacts across the organization and the community. After closing non-essential services earlier in 2020, we're now partially reopened and in phase 3 of the BC's restart plan. While our corporate revenue losses continue, they're now offset through cost management and receipt of the COVID restart grant from the province in last November. Investments in safety continue to be made, and we're planning for continued impacts through 2022. And the COVID grant from the province lasts through that period. Local independent businesses have been hit the hardest as households continue to reallocate spending away from restaurants, recreation, travel, and other services. We continue to explore ways we can support these businesses, though we're limited by legislation on what we can do. The following slides will highlight the service plans, funding gaps, and emerging financial strategies under each of the 5 long-term goals we've identified as an organization. Projects embedded in these goals now total $1.1 billion over the next 10 years. Last year, Council adopted a new reserve funds bylaw, which closely aligns with these goals and provides a tool for Council to adjust ongoing funding levels to match the target service levels in each of these goals. We'll start with livability and mobility, which is broken into 2 parts. There's a little more detail to share on these 2. And as I get to the end of each one, I'll ask if there's any questions with respect to the highlights or emerging financial strategies. Livability. Investments and services here address affordability and care needs and support a more inclusive community. Projects include social and supportive housing, market rental housing, and childcare. Investments in livability also help the way we move, reducing carbon emissions and supporting a local workforce, one of the top concerns of our business community. Of the over 2,000 additional rental housing units, over half of them are for social and supportive housing, and the remainder is for market rental housing. Support for childcare includes over 500 spaces at a higher quality of care, and approximately 60% of those facilities would be facility and land, and the remainder would be land only. This investment maintains the district's current share of childcare spaces as we aim to achieve the spaces identified in the new Childcare Action Plan. Investments in livability are estimated to have an imbalance of approximately $60 million, including the value of lands required to support housing and care under the assumptions in the plan. Once district lands are set aside for these needs, this imbalance will reduce. Identifying options to work with our partners and co-locate services is another important opportunity to improve the district's livability objectives. We're also exploring allocating a fixed percentage of CACs to affordability and housing, and reviewing financing options for social housing construction, so we can learn more about how the market participates in providing those spaces and enable the district to focus more on a key role with respect to leveraging land use and supporting one-time costs related to social housing. That I'll open it up for questions on livability.
I don't see any hands at the moment. Carry on, Rick.
I have a question.
Oh,
I have my
Councilor
hand up.
Mary.
I raised it. It's not working.
Oh,
Um,
I have a question as well, Mayor Levin.
Okay.
so 20% below market is social housing? Social housing rents at a minimum 20% below market.
At a minimum. So for deeper subsidy, when we get into supportive housing, we'll be partnering with BC Housing to achieve those.
So here we go using the multiple terms to describe different kinds of housing. So now it's supportive housing, social housing. Is social also affordable? I wish that we could get a handle on the terminology because it does get a bit confusing. I never thought of social housing at 20% below market. I thought of social housing as those are the ones that, you know, are, you know, at the lowest tier. Because market, I mean, 20% below $3,000 a month is social housing. I'm not clear on that. And then is the 2,000 additional rental housing units on top of already what we're looking at?
That's right.
2,000 more.
In addition to what's been approved already.
Oh, but not what was indicated within the previous plans that we've talked about over the years. You're not adding 2,000 more. You're just 2,000 over and above what has been approved.
To achieve the estimates in those plans. That's right.
Okay. Okay, so the terminology, are we going to clarify that? I'm surprised that finance is using 20% below market to describe social housing. Social the Lions Manor is social housing in my mind. That's what we've always called it. It's not 20% below market. The units in Deep Cove are about $400 a month.
Apologies if I've not kept pace with the definitions. They were taken from the workshop on social, on housing, on the definitions.
Okay, so if planning's here in this meeting, I'm sure they are. I don't understand how we can be like intermingling these terms. We've been doing this for so long, and it's been one of the most confusing parts of housing because it's one day it's below market, then it's affordable housing, then it's social housing, then it's 20% below market. You know, it keeps changing, and I think we really have to be clear. Yeah. Social housing is social housing. Social housing to me is Lions, Rotary, Kiwanis. 20% below market is expensive. So
I don't think Mr. Daniluk intended to redefine terms.
I think that needs to be. I think that needs to be cleared up going forward when we talk to the public about all of this. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Murray. Councillor Hanson.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation so far, Mr. Daniluk. Just dealing with the 60 million shortfall that you talk about to 2030, and then you said that was net of land allocations. I mean, do we have some kind of ref and ready figure as to the value of the lands that are available for those allocations to reduce that funding gap?
Yeah, this is a net amount. It's net of the ongoing funding that we've allocated to lands in the new land reserve. So that's helping reduce the amount. If I'm not mistaken, I believe the total value of the lands here are in the range of $70 million.
Thank you.
Welcome.
And unfortunately, we're just trying to figure out if there's a setting that's limiting the raise hand function. So until that time, I'll just call out. Is anyone else wishing to comment at this time?
Mayor Little.
Yeah, Councillor Curran, go ahead.
Just a question about, I know this is just a discussion, the CAC, that to action that, because it's something that we've talked about since for this entire term, would that be, what would be the step to actually determine what that percentage was and to make that a policy? Just to understand how that would move forward from a discussion point to an actual policy.
There's a review and an analysis to update our information on the remaining growth for the plans, and we'd be looking at that analysis, which will look at housing and potential amenities to recalibrate what a percentage CAC might look like using a fixed rate.
So could I just clarify that then? So it's going to be a discussion about this, there would be a percentage allocated from the CAC to affordable housing. But that would suggest that you would be giving up the CAC in another form. So then there would be a discussion, obviously, about the increased density in order to achieve both.
Potentially, but not necessarily. We'd have to look at how the CACs have changed in the marketplace. There may be an ability to generate more CACs than previously.
Or maybe just review the CACs. I think we've been talking about that for several terms. Do we need all of the CACs that are actually identified? And do we need them at the level that they're at? Like, could we maybe go with the silver model instead of the platinum model in some of these CACs? And maybe step back a bit in regards to how we're redeveloping. Maybe we don't have to have all the bells and whistles. Maybe we could give something up. And I know we've talked about that over the years too, and I don't know how far we've gotten with that. So can you just explain for me the non expert in finance counselor, but the imbalance at 2030 of 60 million and that being 36% of the plan. Can you explain that in a different way to me, please?
Sure. Over the next 10 years, as we look at the investments in livability, which is in primarily rental housing and care.
Rental housing and care. So care being...
sorry, child care.
Oh, child care. Okay.
Yeah. So when we look at those needed investments over the next 10 years and the funding sources, and we look back at how we've been realizing them and apply those assumptions forward, we're left with this gap. It is before applying the lands that have been identified for housing recently.
So we're $60 million short in being able to address housing and childcare, or affordable housing, social housing, something like that, and childcare.
That's right, but the primary tool, and it's the one at the very top, is looking at the sites that you've identified to support housing, and once those sites are confirmed, that will reduce this imbalance.
So once those sites are identified and those lands are rezoned for affordable social housing,
yes,
then the gap of $60 million disappears.
Not entirely, but yes, it reduces. Yeah.
And just tell me why that happens.
Well, through that process, we've now identified lands to support the housing that's required to support the community, and in completing our share of those projects, we then set aside the remaining costs to service and partner, and we're able to realize the housing that we want to in the estimates.
So those are based on partnerships with other organizations that may look at a mix of housing in order to accommodate social housing on any particular site. So you could have market housing, below market, and deep dive social.
You could.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Your worship?
Yes, Councillor Hanson.
So, Mr. Dunlop, I'm just confused because you said that the total value of the lands identified for social housing, if I heard you right, it was 70 million and the deficiency is 60 million. So why doesn't that entirely address the deficiency?
Well, there's new investments required in care, child care as well. And so when you add all of the investments up and offset it, you could start with the lands. It'll reduce the imbalance, but not the entire imbalance.
Thank you.
Your worship.
Councillor Back?
Thanks very much, Mr. Danlick, for the presentation so far. Just on the childcare, I believe it was 500 spaces you have mentioned that we're allocating here. But I know when we recently had the discussion around our childcare strategy, that number was a lot higher. It was like over 2,000 spaces that are needed. So it's concerning to me that number is low here, but I guess recognizing it doesn't take into account the potential partnerships. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I was struggling on how much information to present. And all this provision of approximately 500 spaces allows us to maintain our current share of childcare spaces in the community. So we currently have about 25 or support about 25% of the childcare spaces in the community. As we add these new spaces, which is over 2,000 spaces, we'll maintain our share. Our share can be broken into pieces as well. Of the current share that we have, a certain percentage are supported with only land and a certain percentage are supported with land and facility. So we're just maintaining our current share until we have better information on where council would like to go.
So this isn't allocating any new spaces then?
No, sorry, I should say that differently. It's maintaining our current share as we invest in new spaces. So
Right.
it's
So
our
that
share
number will go up.
the new spaces.
Understood. Thank you.
As a placeholder until we have clear direction from council.
Is
Thank you.
this private childcare?
No.
So shouldn't we look at the private numbers that we've got?
Mr. Milburn?
Thank you, Worship. Just one way to explain this is the childcare strategy that Council recently reviewed and approved identified the need for about 2,000 spaces, is what Councillor Beck mentioned. What Rick has done is tried to look at what would be the district's contribution to achieving that, either on district lands or in district lands and facilities. So, for example, within a new community rec center. And of that 2,000, we had put in an estimate of about 500 spaces that the district would be contributing on district lands or district facilities as a way to make really an assumption, a financial assumption about what that could cost. That, of course, could fluctuate up and down based on council's direction, but that was what was put in this analysis for consideration. Those spaces on district lands could theoretically be provided through a private service provider or a public service provider. And that could be a not-for-profit service provider as well. And sometimes they receive nominal rents from the district when there are not-for-profit renting district lands. So there's lots of different models out there. And I think we're open to having those conversations with council about what model works on district land. This analysis doesn't prejudge whether or not the services are provided by a not-for-profit or a for-profit. That's subject to future council direction. Thank you, Worship.
I think we're having another meeting with the school district, are we not, to talk about this kind of thing? And, you know, I think it's unfortunate that the school district is not, you know, jumping on board and utilizing their own land. It's something that the district always has to deal with. And so it would be nice to be able to incorporate the school district's future plans in putting childcare in schools, because it kind of sounds like a no-brainer. But I guess we'll have that conversation and then see how that works.
Thank you.
Councillor
Curran?
Just one last question, and thanks for the presentation. Do we look into provincial commitments to 2030? And how does that impact this, or that's just a separate conversation? I mean, this is just what it is. And then if we were able to secure funding from a provincial or federal grant, that would be great, but it's not really part of this discussion. Is that accurate?
Actually, with new commitments from the province and the federal government aiming to improve childcare, we're assuming that there will be senior government grants for the facilities, especially outside of the centers. And their grant is assumed to be half of the construction cost per space. So, and I don't think that's an unreasonable assumption when you look at the planning at the provincial and federal level.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Forbes?
No comment other than thank you, Rick, for the presentation.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Bond?
Thanks, Mayor Little. Couple questions. I think one thing that would be really useful, and maybe just hearing from some of the questions from my colleagues here, is that there are a lot of assumptions, obviously, put into this type of long-term financial planning document, and it would be really helpful to help clarify and focus council's conversation, in my opinion, if we had a list of those different assumptions, so that we can review those and comment. The other thing I think would be helpful is source, being very clear about where the source for those assumptions are, like the 2,000 rental homes. That's I'm assuming that's from our rental and affordable housing strategy, but it'd be really good to kind of link all these different assumptions in a way that we can kind of see, where all the different plans have come from and how our finance department with planning and with others have kind of put this into this, very high level presentation. So I think that would be a useful thing going forward. One question I had on the community amenity contributions, I'm wondering what finance's assumption is on the amount of market homes that would need to be approved to use community amenity contributions as a funding source to fill this gap that we're talking about right now, this funding gap.
We're using the estimates in the OCP at this point.
Okay, so that would be approximately 500 new homes a year. If we've got 2,000 of those being rental homes over the next 10 years, that would be 3,000 market homes over the next 10 years.
I'd have to go back and check, but I think it's in that range, yes.
Okay. So I think that's important to in the long-term financial plan to note. Because obviously if we do not approve those homes or council chooses not to, then that funding source is not available. So I think that's kind of one of the, as you're looking at these different funding sources, you have to attach the kind of the risk and the likelihood of those funding sources being available. The other comment I had was maybe Mr. Milburn can just jump in around the definitions that we're using for housing. I know the last time we had BC Housing there, social housing was basically where the government steps in and provides either land or funding in order to achieve a lower rent or a lower cost than what is approved or available in the private market. I'm sure my color is going all funny, but so I would make the assumption here, and Rick and Dan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the 20% below market is basically a worst case scenario, that if the district uses our own land and we have no other funding, that's kind of what would be a viable project for rental homes, would be 20% below market, using obviously the rents and a mortgage through a nonprofit provider if there was no other funding sources. That's kind of what a viable project would be. Obviously we can achieve deeper and less expensive rents if we have other funding from senior levels of government or nonprofits. And maybe you can just either confirm or correct my assumptions there. That would be great. Mr. Milburn.
Well, thank you, Worship. Yes, absolutely. So we've presented to council in the past at a workshop what we described as supportive housing. So this is housing for homeless or those at risk of homelessness, and those rates are typically what are called shelter rates or very, very low rental rates for low income earners. If we move into the into the social housing side, really we're talking about a range of potential incomes and a range of rents. When we look at joint BC housing projects funded under the Community Housing Fund, Council has seen those, that 20, 50, 30 split of the different affordability levels that include for very low income as well as rent geared income. generally based on the housing income limits that the province establishes every year, which this year range from just over $55,000 up to just over $83,000 based on the size of the unit and the income of the individual. And then the sort of moderate income is what I would describe it as that higher end of incomes that range from about, that low $80,000 a year up to around just over $100,000 a year, which was the median household income in 2016. So these ranges were shown to council, and really the depth of affordability is exactly as Councillor Bond has mentioned. It depends on the amount of subsidy that can be provided from various levels of government or negotiated with a developer when you're seeing a discounted rent level in a private development. So we always have conversations with council where we share the specific rent levels proposed in the project, and then that's reviewed and determined to be acceptable or not based on council's direction at the time. Now, from a planning perspective, we're currently consulting with, of course, our housing task force, seeking input on affordability levels that would be appropriate going forward, as well as the housing continuum, so the number of units in each various housing type, seeking that kind of advice so we can give council some good direction coming from the community, and then enter those kinds of assumptions into this high level analysis that Rick is mentioning and show the assumptions just as you've mentioned, so that we can say, okay, in this scenario, here's how much affordability we can achieve. That doesn't mean we're committed to it. For a scenario analysis point of view, what it means is this is what would happen in this particular projection. And then council, of course, can refine its objectives based on the financial consequences. And that's what this tool is helping us to do. Thank you, Worship.
Thanks.
And just a brief follow-up on the request for assumptions and sources. I completely agree with that. This first high-level look, there's lots of assumptions and a long list of variables and sources that impact the analysis. So it's just an initial look, and as we get some direction, and especially from the other workshops, we'll bring it together in options and make sure that you have that information.
Your Worship?
Councillor Forbes.
Can I just make a comment? I think we need to explain, depending on how we take this out to the public, I think we need to be able to explain our definitions and be able to explain when we say there's an imbalance of 60 million, what that means, and also be able to explain the impact on the different reserve accounts, because people were interested in that. But my comment is to do with the assumption that all of that land, all of the particular land parcels that were presented to us were accepted by us to be used, to be developed for housing, whatever kind of housing we're talking about. And I'm not sure we actually got to that point because there were concerns about having to clear lots, the difficulty of getting service to some of those lots. So are you talking about just the particular lots that were presented to us as the 70 million, or are you talking about our total capability in land to address the situation?
I'm not linking the dollar figure to those lots. I'm just saying that those lots are one of the emerging strategies that we have to identify the imbalance.
Right, but is that our total lots? Or does that 70 million represent just those lots that we've already identified, or does that represent what we hold?
It just represents an approximation of the land required to support the units that we're talking about.
60 or 70 million?
It's approximately 70 million in land. That number is offset by the ongoing money that we've set aside for lands. That's why it's not lined up with the imbalance.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Miri, I saw your hand.
I think Mr. Stewart's dream is turning into a nightmare. I just want to, long-term planning, like I understand why we want to do it. But I think we also have to plan forward and be able to respond to change. Change creates a need to reflect. Certainly this pandemic has shown us that we need to reflect on how we do things. And there are maybe new ways to do things that don't cost as much money. For instance, if we have a percentage of our employees remaining at home and have flexibility with how we operate our organization, then maybe we don't have to spend the money to expand the hall for an increased number of employees. But the same could be said in how we treat CACs, and certainly the City of Vancouver is having this conversation. Because we've become very reliant on CACs to pay for things. In fact, I'd say we're a bit addicted to it. And I, for years, have been saying, you know, the CACs, when I first started as a councillor in '96, CACs did not exist. CACs became relevant because local communities that were dealing with increased density felt that there should be something in it for the community when we were, you know, approving these developments. There should be something that was given back. And actually that got skewed over the years too, because then those CACs had to remain in the area where the developments were existing, and they never reached the far corners of the broader community. So, you know, that was something that was certainly not the original intention of creating amenities for the broad community to use. They were ultimately identified for the areas that were being redeveloped. I continue to worry about the amount of money that we are spending, the amount of plans that we have, the amount of redevelopment in all of our infrastructure, our own infrastructure, plus all the infrastructure that looks after all of this new development. And I think we need to have a discussion about what all of this redevelopment, you know, there's pros and there's cons. What is the future of this municipality? Because it's not the place to start a family anymore. It's not a starter community. You know, you can look at neighborhoods in the British properties that are half empty. Homes that are being listed on MLS that have no furniture in them. Old homes, not new ones, old ones. You know, what is the future of our community when homes are, you know, $4 and $5 million, townhouses are $2 million. You know, the land lift, the value of assessments, every time, and I've said this ad nauseum over the years, every time we change, every time we develop, every time something is rebuilt, shiny and new, the value of the land goes up. So I really think that we need to have a check in. And Mayor Little, I hope that you agree that we do need to understand where we're at, what our true priorities are, how we want to sustain our community going forward, and is this the way we're going to do it? Because the cost of living has never been more expensive. It's never been more expensive to live in the district of North Vancouver than it is now. And I don't see it going, I don't see it getting cheaper. We are creating a community for the wealthy. You know, we can build market rental and we can build some social housing. But, you know, there's a direct correlation to where you live and how much things cost. And I don't think that we're truly thinking about what affordability means. And I personally don't think we need half of the stuff that we say we need. I think we just like it and we want it, and shopping's fun and spending's fun. And I think we've let a lot of it get away from us. So I think we need to review that as we go forward too.
Thank you, Councillor.
Just sorry if I might, Councillor Mary, just a couple of follow-up comments on that. We'll get to affordability from the ratepayer perspective in a few more slides, and affordability from a housing perspective within this context, aiming to achieve the estimates in this plan, I believe, moves us from approximately 4% of the housing stock as affordable to up to 6% of the housing stock as affordable. I'd have to double check those numbers, but I think that's where we get to by 2030. Having a comprehensive and integrated planning approach that looks at all these aspects challenges staff to come up with options. I can say less than 5 years ago, there was no ongoing funding for active transportation. And now we have a 5-year plan with a $30 million investment in active transportation. That's funded by growth outside of the community. Outside of the centers and from within the neighborhoods. A few years ago, there were no reserves, and you've now instructed us to put those reserves in place to support these goals. And we've moved forward with the housing that's in our plans in a meaningful way. And we have reserves to support those investments. So I know this isn't perfect, and we started with one of the more complex goals, very, very complex from my perspective. And my read of the information in front of you is it's reasonably accurate, and it's a gap that we can work with you to address.
I'm not sure what reserves have to do with a discussion on CACs and whether or not we rebuild parks at $2 or $3 million. How many parks do we need? How many plazas do we need? How many fountains do we need? It's that kind of thing that is raising the value of everything we have, because we like that platinum level of infrastructure. And the Cove is a great example. We have a plan to completely redesign the lower half of Gallant. That does something to the valuation of the area around it. It does something to the assessment values. And it's kind of ironic that we are so challenged at dealing with all the people that are visiting the Cove right now, but we turn around and create another attraction so we can bring more people down to the Cove. I sometimes, we fight with ourselves about this. We're trying to solve something, and actually in the consequences seem to be more of an impact than a solution. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the deliverables we're talking about today are things that have been agreed to by the council through our plans. And I would agree with you that when we did the official community plan, I remember supporting it, but saying in my comments that if we actually build it out the way it is proposed entirely, it would make for some fairly unaffordable neighborhoods, because a lot of the proposals were these wide, broad sidewalks with trees everywhere and furniture and fancy garbage cans and everything. Like, everything was so expensive that that it was going to raise the value in those neighborhoods beyond any affordability that we thought we were achieving it. But at least for the purposes of today's discussion, I think long-term planning is going to be beneficial, especially if it's in line with the goals set by the council. And I think that that's reflected in this so far. I will just point out we are on slide 12 of 34, and we are halfway through our time. So I'm going to, unless there's something critical by council, I'm going to press that we move on. Okay. Rick.
Moving on to mobility, these plans include investments in the range of $300 million over the next 10 years, with approximately 1/3 of that investment in active and safe transportation options. Improvements are aimed at promoting ease of mobility to and between the centers. Plans also include capacity improvements in collaboration with other North Shore municipalities, which aim to attract investments to the North Shore. Investments in mobility also benefit the environment and our local economy. As I mentioned a few years ago, there wasn't any ongoing funding for the new investments in active transportation. And we continue to direct tax revenue from redevelopment to these needs. And ongoing funding to support these efforts reaches $2.7 million this year. Planned investments here have an estimated imbalance of approximately $40 million at the end of the 2030. Revisiting options, funding, and timing for cycling routes may have the most impact on this gap, as well as prioritizing investments in the centers to enable critical networks to be completed and support the planned shift in travel modes. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions on mobility, and maybe we'll just skip back to the planned investments, where we're looking to expand the network by 42 kilometers and support all the other improvements on this slide. Now, this build out of the active network doesn't build out the entire vision, but it does build out the vision that was shared in earlier November of last year.
Yeah, I've been very supportive of the the increase in active transportation goals in the plan. I'm glad to see that we're hopefully crossing over to more than 50% of our capital plan that's dedicated to transportation being focused on active transportation going forward. I think that that's going to be a generation of us playing catch up on that, but it is, as I said before, sort of the gift we give to future generations on the North Shore is the infrastructure that we invest in today that helps them move around the community freely and hopefully with sufficient options other than cars that people will be able to make the switch. And so better bike and walking spaces, better bus options for people. And so keep going. I'm very supportive of us moving forward on the active transportation file. Don't see any other hands at the moment.
Your Worship?
Councillor Hanson?
Yeah, I'm just confused in terms of emerging strategies. So there's a $40 million deficit with respect to our 2030 goals. So perhaps you could just clarify, and thank you for your presentation on this, but Mr. Daniluk, just could you clarify how we're going to be addressing that 40 million?
Sure. Right now, when we look out over the 10 years, the investment in transportation and mobility is in the range of $300 million. The active transportation investment is ambitious, so there are some lower cost options that we could look at working with the engineering team and the planning teams. There are transportation demand management strategies that are being looked at, as well as some other funding sources. We could be looking at, it's not on here, but there's often grants supporting this type of work, and we'll continue to monitor those and leverage as much of that funding as we can. There are regional planning initiatives that we might be able to leverage to help our community. And then in terms of the centers, I believe some ways to complete those connections would definitely help us with our mobility goals. So just looking at perhaps prioritizing those investments and accelerating their implementation to help us switch over is something that we should look at.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just say that from my point of view, we shouldn't be scaling back our goals. And from my point of view, it should be possible to achieve grants. We're only talking about $4 million a year in senior government funding for these initiatives that, in my view, are timely. They are a gift to future generations, and they fit into a lot of policy initiatives that are a high priority at all levels of government. So I would encourage us to set our sights high and find that extra 40 million from my point of view.
Thank you, Councillor. Sorry, Mr. Stewart, were you, so your camera go on?
No, I'm here. Your Worship, I just wanted to remind Council, this is really an introduction to a very big and long-standing issue. And so We're just trying to give you a sense right now that if Rick has gone away, based on all the plans we've got, tried to do his best guess on where the finances will land on this. There's lots of conversations, and I think the next workshop we have will probably get into more operating and capital details, so you understand what that $40 million actually looks like. And later in the presentation, you'll also have perhaps a better understanding how finance is proposing to address these particular issues.
Thank you. Okay. Carry on, Rick.
Sure. Moving on to the next goal. So this is investments in safety, health, and resiliency. And we're looking at investments totaling over $250 million in our facility improvements here, supporting this goal. Projects include improvements or replacements to our community hubs, fire facilities, parks, and libraries. Highlights shown aim to meet the community's changing needs, improve access to services, and help keep the community safe. Investments here include some of the more important financial decisions for council over the time horizon for this plan. And these investments also support the livability and mobility. The needs for recreation and arts and culture are being identified through studies through the Recreation Commission and a brand new strategic facilities plan. Plan investments here have an imbalance of approximately $80 million, and emerging financial strategies listed here will be brought back to council through a workshop on facilities planned for later in the year. These strategies include consolidating standalone end-of-life buildings into the community hubs, and reviewing our role and funding for exclusive use of our facilities, along with exploring partnerships with the development community. If there's any questions on this goal.
And our raise hand function is back working again, apparently.
Oh,
Councillor Forbes, go ahead.
just want to ask what you mean by community hub.
I'll be careful on how I answer this one. We do have a definition of all of these improvements. We have a booklet based from the workshops. I don't have the definition of community hub in front of me, but generally it includes recreation, arts, culture, and social services, along with other community facilities that might make sense to fit into the hub and make the services more accessible and convenient for the community to use.
Is that different than when, I know we talk about community centers, we talk about community villages, and now we have community hub. Is it different than centers and villages?
Similar to the community centers, and they might include other facilities identified that support the community and might be consolidated into a hub.
Your worship, there's two components to this, if I could speak.
Please.
One is that we have heard the term community hub being used to describe library facilities, museum facilities, and recreation facilities. So this concept of the idea that you don't just do standalone, but you actually take a look at what the community needs, and then you actually deliver that in a more decentralized way. In some cases, we'll be consolidating. In other cases, we'll have smaller facilities available in town centers. So I don't think we should get hung up on whether it's a village, a center, or a hub. It's a place for people that are in that local area to meet and engage in certain kinds of activities. And as far as I'm concerned, as I say, the idea of a community hub really now is starting to span across all of those soft services, library, recreation, museum, etc. So we'll be looking to, as we create the town centers, try to put in, as we have in Capilano, a small library service, not not replicate the one that's in Capilano, but a small recreational service. Same thing with the one in Lynn Creek, where we're looking at daycare, for example. So community hubs can have all kinds of partners and all kinds of different services. It really depends on that particular area and the neighborhood.
Okay, I don't want to get into it now. It's not the right time, but it seems to me we've already defined in the OCP that community centers were supposed to literally be self-sufficient, which would already include those types of things. But in any case, I'll move on.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Councillor Kern.
Yeah, I before Dave spoke, I was just going to say there is just it seems to be a trend of looking at space that exists and seeing how it can best be used optimally, like throughout 24 hours a day, potentially, like how a lot of places sit empty during certain weekdays. And I think it's just a new way of looking at it, because the cost of land is so prohibitive from doing new things, and looking at fire halls for housing. And there's all sorts of creative ways to do this. So I think that was my sort of interpretation of that. But sounds like that's kind of what we're talking about, is just potentially sharing space in a new way.
Yeah, Councillor Curran's nailed it. It's the idea we have limited space, so we have to look what the community needs, and we have to start looking at different kinds of configurations for service delivery in those particular spaces.
Thank you. Mr. Daniluk.
Okay, let's move on to climate and the environment. Here, we're striving to lead in climate action and the environment, and we'll invest in mitigation, adaptation, our natural assets, utilities infrastructure, and community education. Projects and initiatives aim to reduce our emissions, provide energy efficient infrastructure, protect and restore our ecosystems, and promote community stewardship and responsibility for the natural environment. For now, this area is shown with no imbalance. It excludes any provisions for emerging risks, like you've seen in some of the hazard adaptation plans that have come before Council. A new climate office includes project teams specifically established to move forward our community energy and emissions plan and green building initiatives as we look to accelerate the implementation of these plans and initiatives. As we begin integrating climate action into our decision making, we'll be valuing carbon, natural assets, and measuring our environmental impacts as we make decisions. Metro Vancouver is leading in carbon pricing in the region as it makes decisions and has a clear policy on how they do that, and they use a rate of $160 per ton in their decision making. And the federal government just recently announced that they'll be moving the carbon tax up to $170 per ton by 2030. Here we'll also be looking at external funding sources, partners. We'll be looking at potentially at an eco-levy to help support some of the environment projects and change some of the behaviors. And of course, we have a climate and innovation reserve to access to support new projects as we learn more about how we might reach these goals and achieve our targets by 2030 and 2050. Are there any questions on climate and the environment?
I was going to say, Rick, this is really an emerging area. When we say that the imbalance is zero, it's just because I don't think we've really nailed down the kinds of decisions and the costs associated with that. But I do know that in the next 6 months to a year, we'll have made a lot of progress on this, and this will be really well understood heading into 2022.
Might have been better off to say it's priceless, right, than rather than $0. Councillor Curran. Oh, you're muted.
Wow, I've made it till 6:06 without being muted today on Zoom calls. So I just wanted to I think it's going to be really important to look at that, just specifically the adaptation pieces. I know the DMAF, which is the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, which is $2 billion through 2028 from the federal government, is fully subscribed. So they're out of money in its 2021. And so the FCM has estimated $5 billion annually at the municipal level for adaptation. So I am questioning some of, I think we'll get more out of the climate action and natural systems department, which I'm super excited about. And I just wanted to like give high fives to staff, because I know a lot of great work is happening behind the scenes, and really integrating, because we're going to be leaders in the world. That's what Rick and we have decided, everyone. So get on board. But the idea of integrating the natural assets with the carbon budgeting, and so that we as a council can make decisions through understanding how it fits into our carbon budget. And that's a trend that's happening at all levels of government, that especially to get municipal or to get federal funding now, you have to have a carbon assessment on projects to get money from the federal government. So right now it's at a high threshold, I think, of 10 million, but that's changing. So I'm just really excited about the work that's happening in this section. So shout out to staff for all their hard work. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. See no further hands. So, yeah, no further hands. So back to you, Rick.
Thank you. Moving on to the economy. Investments here and projects support economic activity and a balanced and fair economy. While it's not shown on this slide, in the near term, we're also reviewing options to support our local independent businesses, which have been hit hardest by COVID. Projects over the long term include improvements to district-owned commercial properties and the acquisition of new lands. Community plans aim to add over 100,000 square meters of business space and create over 5,000 new jobs, supporting our local economy over the next 10 years. Attracting and retaining investment in our community requires we remain competitive and fair with our property taxes. While this area shows no imbalance at present, it does provide opportunities to address imbalances in the other areas. And the emerging strategies here include rezoning district lands to support employment and mixed use, updating our property tax strategies, including industry, business, and social housing, and permissive tax exemptions related to social housing. Financing land acquisitions is an option to look at when it makes sense, and leading in municipal finance reform as we aim to change legislation and improve fairness, not only in our system, but in the regional and provincial systems. And we do that through good relations with other levels of government.
Can I just ask a question about highest and best use? Where
yes,
are we with
Councillor?
that?
Sorry, in what regard?
With any discussions with other levels of government? I know that we were looking at I brought it up with our new MLA, the concern of highest and best use, the value of the assessments, elevated land prices.
So BC assessment, Rick?
Protection of, current businesses.
If Andy's on the line, I know he's.
I am.
This.
So we have we've tested the latest legislation from the province that came out last year, the Municipal Validating and Enabling Act. It is a frustrating piece of legislation. We'll be bringing back our response to that back to Finance and Audit. The use of it at this point in time is not recommended. It is not viable. There's lots of complexities to it. Having said that, though, the province has told us through the Intergovernmental Working Group at Metro that it'll be 2023 before they look at the business subclass. And a lot of that is driven by the complexities around updating BC assessment systems. They just can't flick a switch and get that done. Some of the challenges we also face is updating our own local systems through Tempest and with other providers that are out there in the marketplace. So there's a challenge in that regard too. With regard to the continuing conversation on highest and best use, We are meeting on municipal finance reform with the City of Vancouver next week, at least at District and Coquitlamar, in my role as chair of the Regional Finance Officers Committee. And we are working, I'll say, actively behind the scenes to ensure that Metro's Finance and Intergovernance Committee does take this on as a priority. It is on their work plan.
Thank you.
Mandy? Councillor, thank you. Councillor Curran?
Would you please go back, Rick, one slide? I just wanted to see the 100,000 square meters of new commercial and light industrial space, over 5,000 jobs. So that's as reflected in the OCP to 2030 for that. Is that what that's what that is?
It's the remaining estimates to get to those original estimates. That's right.
Okay. So that'll be a much bigger, I guess, discussion about that. And then I would just mention, as there's lots of data coming out, or at least estimates coming out from across Canada, about 25% or more of small businesses will not make it through COVID. That's obviously going to have a significant impact, both in the fabric of our community and in our tax, in the tax revenue, since a large percentage of our taxes do come from business. And so I'm sure we're going to have a much broader discussion about that, but that's something coming up. And then the highest and best use, I would be curious to know, if our dreams came true as small business owners and we didn't have to pay for air, what that would mean to our revenues as a municipality. I think that's unlikely to happen anytime soon, it sounds like. But yeah, I just, again, that is devastating to especially small businesses. They're not going to be able to keep paying this tax for future development. So anyway, lots to discuss on this file. Thanks.
I think it's important to remember that when the OCP was first considered, we checked with BC Assessment several times. We checked with the ministry to determine whether or not potential future zoning. Mr. Bidwell, the director of planning at the time, made several calls, and it was confirmed with the ministry and BC Assessment that the air parcel would not be on the backs of small business. And it's why politicians have such a great reputation. And ultimately that did not happen. And we've lost hundreds of businesses because of it. But I think it's also important to recognize that when we built that OCP, the reason that we included those densities and those land use maps the way we did was to provide some certainty to the development community. And look where it got us. None of those town centers have ever, all of the developments that are identified in those town centers, the concept was densities could go up to, but ultimately they have, for the vast majority of them, maxed out on the densities. And so we've lost businesses. The up to has never been considered by the majority of developers in the area. And we've lost valuable industrial land. On the industrial land, the 100,000 square meters, where is that? Maplewood? Or where's
I
that
don't have
land?
that information at my fingertips, but we do have that. We could get back to you.
Okay.
Unspecified planning goal, I think. But Mr. Stewart.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, Your Worship, but at the end of the day, we're definitely going to lose some businesses due to COVID, but it's the owners of the properties that pay in many cases, the property tax is based on rent and leases. I've just seen some stats that suggest that there may be a 25% reduction in some of the office space down in Vancouver, but we're seeing businesses move out to Class B and C office space in the suburbs, which is cheaper. So it'll be interesting to see how this changes over time.
Yeah, and that's an important point, is that it's the landowner that pays pays the business tax. Obviously, we look at it as being the person who cuts the check, which is the tenant. But if the tenant didn't pay, it'd be the landowner, and the landowner technically forgoes it built into their monthly rental rate to the commercial tenant. And so if there is no commercial tenant, the bill still gets paid. It just gets paid by the landowner. And so then I think more what I think Councillor Kern was talking about was sort of a rebalancing of the distribution between the classes. If we were to try to put more relief for the commercial classes, then we'd have to actually do a class redistribution, not just simply recognize that a business goes out of business, therefore we're just forgoing that tax. That doesn't happen. The landowner still pays the tax. But
no, you're quite correct, Bishop, and certainly redistribution amongst the taxes is probably one of the easier tools that council has. The challenge is that because business relationships and contracts and agreements are so complex depending on the circumstance, what's difficult is to provide relief to those that actually need it, as opposed to those that are, for some example, are subleasing from Safeway. And I don't mean to use Safeway in a derogatory word. We have lots of big units that have lots of sublessees, and that's the challenge, is that the legislation we have is just a big clumsy hammer right now, not necessarily the thing that needs to help the people that are really suffering, such as the small and medium-sized businesses.
Yeah, and since our tools are limited to the class level, we have lots of businesses that are not in peril mixed in with some very vulnerable small businesses. And so you give the benefit to the whole class because we don't have the tools to target individuals. So we're left to look to other ways to help businesses in those areas with parking regulations, curbside regulations, improvements that we may do to an area to target a benefit for a particular development. But we don't have the ability, because we have to work at the class level for taxes, to be able to target benefits. Councillor Back, you're muted. Oh, you're not muted, but I'm afraid your microphone is not working. I can't hear you. That's okay.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yes. Yes.
Just wondered if any staff could comment a little bit more on Lynn Valley Village, the commercial property improvements there that are cited as a highlight. Just kind of what that looks like at a high level.
I can briefly comment. We're well into the life of that those facilities, and some reinvestments are required over the next 10 years, just part of regular asset management planning. And some of them are a little bit more significant, so it's highlighted there, just to be aware.
Yeah, Your Worship, if I could just comment to build on Rick's statements. We have worked with our tenants where our tenants specifically are unable to pay the rent on time, and we have entered into some rent deferral agreements, and we are seeing some of those businesses recover and in fact starting to pay their rent again. And so we'll be working with them going into a program probably to spread out the repayment over a 1 or 2 year period, because what we want to do is ensure that they maintain their sustainability. And so that is what we're doing there, and with few exceptions, we're actually getting some pretty good cooperation from the business side.
Thank you. Does my mic work now?
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate that update from you, Mr. Stewart, as well. Just because I know with the deferrals, it's going to create a challenge for a lot of businesses now as they try and have to pay those back in one or a few months. So I'm glad that that's being spread out for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Back. Back to you, Rick.
Okay, I'm just going to highlight a couple of things here before we move on to the next goal. I'm bringing back this chart just to show the effectiveness of our current approach to property taxes and what the impact over the last 10 years looks like and how we compare in the region. I just wanted to emphasize that we continue to focus a lot of these resources on critical infrastructure supporting the community under that approach. And then just to bring to Council's attention that We're quite proud of the work on asset management and how it impacts quality of life in the district. And your leadership role here is critical to our success. This slide shows the district's presence at Asset Management BC, including a recent statement by Mayor Little on the importance of investing in our core infrastructure. Here I'd like to point out that with rising costs and new standards, climate action, and recently COVID, all of these changes are impacting our asset management planning, and our steady approach provides the flexibility we need to keep pace with these changes. So just wanted to say we really appreciate Council's leadership and support with respect to asset management.
Long commitment.
Moving on to organizational resiliency. Here we're investing in our organization to support our ability to implement the plans and strategies and the other long-term goals. Projects supported and engaged in nimble public service with the tools and workspaces to effectively deliver services and engage meaningfully with the community. Projects include improvements to our digital and technology services, staff retention and engagement, and improving our communications, as well as leading in climate action. These support costs will remain approximately the same as a percentage of the other services over a 10-year period. And of course, we expect an increased demand, a continued increased demand for our digital and technology services as we renew our investments there and keep pace with demands for those services. Planned investments here have an imbalance of approximately 20 million, and the imbalance is primarily due to the need to upgrade our municipal facilities at the District Hall and the Operations Center. Like the safety, health, and resiliency goal, this imbalance will be addressed through the workshop on facilities. And emerging strategies here will help us reimagine our work environment and assess our capacity to deliver on our plans, as well as explore financing options as borrowing rates are at historic lows and most of our needed new investments are in long-lived assets. So it makes sense for us to take a look at that strategy now. And if you look back 10 years and what our percentage debt servicing was of our revenue compared to now, it's lower. I think we're in the range of 2% or lower when you compare that debt servicing to our ongoing revenue. So we're quite low as it stands right now. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions on this goal.
Council? Okay. Back to you, Rick.
Okay. This is a summary of the gaps that we've reviewed by goal. About half of the gap relates to livability and mobility, and half relates to our facilities, and primarily our community and fire facilities. The majority of the gap you can see is in the outer years, showing 156 million in the outer 5 years. And we'll be updating this analysis as we go through the workshop series and continue to develop our emerging financial strategies. Use of district lands, taking a fresh look at our facilities and transportation needs and exploring financing limits are the primary means to bring the plans into balance, and adjusting revenues and services will also help us to bring the plans into balance over the 10-year term. These are the next steps for this plan. Staff will continue to work on the emerging financial strategies and attend future workshops that inform this plan, as well as lead the workshops on financing. And part 2 of the long-term financial plan is envisioned towards the end of this year.
Okay.
And this is the recommendation included in the report.
Councillor Kern?
Thanks. I just wanted to make a general comment about as we head into the next stage and maybe hear from staff about the idea of I know that there is a Canadian Index of Well-being that actually is using Stats Canada data to measure how we're doing on health and happiness and equity and all of these different measures. I think I know Ottawa or Waterloo, I think University is doing that, aligning with the SDGs, et cetera. But I just think that would be helpful. I heard someone else say that a financial budget is a moral compass, like it's what you're putting your how you're spending your money based on what your values are as a community. And so I think hopefully our values are building an equitable, sustainable, much what our OCP stated. But I think I came across a policy, a corporate policy from many moons ago that sometimes you find old corporate policies online that may or may not be active. And so I don't know if Dave or someone could speak to that, but the idea of using more data to measure, how long people are talking about how long they're commuting and how that's impacting both our air quality and their quality of life, and how much free time people feel like they have, and really using that health, both mental health and physical health, as really important measures in where we allocate funds, I think would be helpful. And I just wondered if staff could comment on that as we move forward. Thanks.
Your worship, I would say a good 2 decades ago, we looked at quality of life measures, which was the nomenclature of the day, and we developed a bunch of metrics. So we'll be looking at all of those as part of this long-range financial plan to develop something that can not only say, do we understand what our targets are? Are they based on evidence and good information? And then alternatively, how do we actually measure our progress? And that's always been one of the difficult challenges that we face with using long-term measures, is obviously they last way longer than a particular council term. And so it's really hard to get people excited about measures that you're probably not going to see anything meaningful happen for 5 or 10 or 15 years. So, but as part of this long-range financial plan, that's exactly what we'd like to have a conversation with council about, which is to say, if we kind of land on what's important in the next 10 or 20 years, how are we going to measure it? I think the challenge is not going to be finding a way to fund it. It's going to be a way to agree on what the prioritization is, and then agree on the ways that those are going to be funded. So those are coming up in future workshops. I think this is going to be a really exciting little adventure we're going down. And it's not done by a lot of municipalities who want to look at 10 and 20 years old. So we're leaders in this regard, and I look forward to those discussions with council.
Mr. Stewart, Councillor Bond.
Thanks, Mayor Lowell. I think one aspect of these investments as well, and looking long term, is also trying to quantify how some of these investments might actually reduce kind of our long-term operating costs and our long-term life cycle and replacement costs and our risks as a municipality compared to, let's say, the status quo. So how investments in livability, in rental housing, in mobility, in safety will actually put the organization in our community in a better place than we are today. Obviously, there's an investment up front that needs to be made for that to happen, but over the long term, how do these investments either make our community a better place to live, but also make it a more quote unquote affordable place to live? So how do these investments reduce our ongoing operating costs? And so I think that's a bit of a different lens that I didn't necessarily hear tonight, but I'm trust that, Rick, you're probably thinking about that as well. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that in future sessions, just to I think of the investments that we're making right now in adaptation in terms of a lot of the engineering infrastructure that we're investing in. That's reducing long-term operating costs. It's reducing risk as well. So those things are kind of hard to quantify in a financial plan, but I think it's important to mention and explain those things as well. just as another reason why these investments are being made.
Just a few quick follow-up comments on that. Our current business case process does look at the net change between options for particular investments, including life cycle costs and the incremental community benefits that we're getting between the different options. So definitely those things are things that we're tracking, and part of the struggle is just finding a simple way to communicate some of that information and the options that are available.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Bond. Councillor Forbes.
Thank you. I'd just like to make a comment when we're talking about, I should have made it under the health and I forget the title now, but anyway, there's no mention, or we didn't bring up anything, and I hope that we get into a conversation at some point about long-term care. Not just the housing that we did mention tonight, but I think we're going to need to talk about that because we can't just, at least I feel, we can't just leave that up to the private sector. And I don't know how much we need to look into what government will do to help us out to provide long-term care in the future for a larger demographic that will need long-term care. That's all.
Thank you, Councillor Forbes. So just my general comments, I support the long-term planning. I know, Rick, again, you've gone for a recommendation at a workshop. We don't tend to put forward a motion at these, but I think you're hearing around the table that there's support for long-term planning, and a lot of feedback has been given already on what we'd like to see in our next meetings going forward on the matter. My challenge is always that when you have 3-year planning, there's always a bunch of stuff hanging out in year 4. When you have 5-year planning, there's always stuff hanging out in year 6. And so my concern is that as we go to 10, the decisions that we haven't made, haven't got direction from the provincial government or federal government, they're all just going to hang out in year 11 of your planning, right? And so where does a Ron Andrews replacement fit in? Where do all of these key facility replacement projects fit in? And up until now, they've been hanging out in year 6. And then we work them in when the funds come forward with partnerships, with redevelopment sometimes. So that would be my only concern, is that it makes some medium-term projects look like they're really long-term projects because you can't actually get to the point where you've decided when it's officially going to come in. That'd be my only concern about the long-term planning process, is that it's going to give a false sense of pushing out the undecided piece way out into the future, and give the look that we don't have to worry about that for 10 more years. The reality is the decision just hasn't been made yet, so it hasn't been put into the long-term plan where it probably belongs. And so that'd be my only concern with that kind of thing, is that we're fairly comfortable with lots of stuff hanging out just beyond the scope of our decision making. And if we push to 10-year plans, then we're going to have items that are going to be sitting way out in the future. But I don't know if you have a response for that, Rick. It's more just a frustration with planning envelopes anyway.
I just wanted to quickly respond and say I completely agree. And one of the objectives of the process is to be as transparent as possible. And as we look at a time horizon that includes the OCP out to 2030, it's a fairly comprehensive look, but you're right, there will be things outside of the 10 years. But the key one that I mentioned tonight is the building out of the active transportation network, which is going to focus on key connections, but not the whole vision. So measuring the whole vision, I think, is important, and having some communication around the full vision, whether it's inside the 10 years or outside, is also important.
Thank you. Councillor Hanson, Councillor Kern. Councillor Hanson, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Rick again for the planning, and I certainly support the exercise, and I look forward to working through the exercise. I suppose a caution that I would inject into the discussion, as has arisen in other discussions before council, when we're dealing with the uncertainty of the times that we live in, we're dealing with the uncertainty of COVID and the impacts of that, and the impacts of events yet to unfold. I suppose, caution us all to be careful in the degree to which we can predict. And something like 10 years from now, I think in the modern world is all but forever. But notwithstanding that, I do look forward to the exercise, and I think it is valuable, obviously, for the district. One thing I would like to say is if we do have any time, I would very much appreciate hearing from anyone in the public who might want to weigh in and respond to some of the things that have occurred today. So I do hope there's a little bit of time left over to your public input on this today.
Yeah, we didn't have any interest from the public up till noontime today for a speakers list on this. We do have a speakers list set up for the regular meeting coming up at 7 o'clock. But obviously it's an open conversation and members of the public can send us emails. They can speak at the 3-minute section of our regular meetings. And then as we go forward with other financial planning meetings, there will be lots of opportunity for public comment. Councillor Curran.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo the idea of looking at life cycle cost analysis. And I think there is some emerging data that will be helpful for us to look at the cost of inaction versus the cost of action over time on certain projects. And, you know, there is some data that's showing if you invest X now, it's worth this much to the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So I think looking at policies, kind of back to our idea of looking at every space that we have as how can it be shared and how can it be used differently. Everything that we do can be a solution to improve equity, to improve our biodiversity, to reduce our carbon. So I think we're going to have to really look at things a lot differently. This is the decade of transformation. Like we have to really transform our communities in now 9 years. So I'm excited about this process. I've never been more excited about financial planning, Mayor Little.
Rick is always excited about financial planning. So Rick, any final comments?
Just to say, and thanks for your time tonight. I am excited about this process as well. It is the first time in a long time that we've been able to get a good measure of where we're at, reflecting all of the plans as best possible. And so we feel good about that, and we feel good about participating in the related workshops for the year and bringing it all back and to summarize a few options and help us move to the next step. So I appreciate all the comments and feedback tonight.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, other members of staff, for contributing. We do appreciate it. Council, have a stretch. We will be resuming the meeting. Just to check in, Genevieve, do we have a different link for the 7 o'clock meeting, or is it the same link?
Your worship, it is the same link.
Same link. Okay. So you can just mute and shut off your camera and then resume the meeting at 7 o'clock. See you then.
Thanks, Rick. Good job.